What I wanted to share this morning is from Luke 18. There's a point where Jesus, he makes a statement. He basically says, when I return, will I find faith on the earth? He says, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? And seeing that question made me wonder, what does he mean by faith? How does Jesus define faith? And as I meditated on this passage, this simple passage in Luke 18, I feel like I got a good picture of how Jesus defines faith, and then a good word of encouragement for me for how I can exhibit it in my life. So if you'll look with me at Luke 18, starting in verse 1. The passage that ends in verse 8 ends with Jesus saying, when I return, will I find faith on the earth? So what is he referring to? It says, he was telling them a parable to show them at all times they ought to pray and to not lose heart, saying, in a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him, saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out. Remember, Jesus is describing the faith that he hopes to see. Verse 6 says, and the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? So from this parable, what I can see is that one way Jesus defines faith is, I see a few phrases here. The first is in verse 1, praying at all times. And then in verse 5, continually coming to God. And then in verse 7, crying out day and night. I see that the way Jesus defines faith, the kind of faith he's looking for when he returns is, are we crying out day and night for the rightful possession which God has promised? Do we see it as a matter of justice that we receive what God has promised? And those who cry out day and night are those who demonstrate the kind of faith that Jesus is hoping to see when he returns. And so I was thinking about this, crying out day and night, and there are two times in particular that I see the scriptures exhorting us to cry out day and night. They're when we don't get what we want and when we do get what we want. We should cry out day and night when we don't get what we want and when we do. There's a parable, it's actually a story in Matthew 15, if you want to turn there. It's the story of the Syrophoenician woman. And it really spoke to me. She spoke to me as an example of someone crying out day and night. Someone who exhibited the kind of faith that Jesus was talking about. She's one of the few people of whom Jesus said, what great faith. Your faith is great, is what he says in Matthew 15:28. So how did she demonstrate this faith of continually coming, crying out day and night? One thing we see from the Syrophoenician woman is that she demonstrated persistence in the face of opposition. When it didn't look like she was going to get what she wanted or what she was asking, she refused to believe anything less than God's utter goodness. We see here, if you look at starting in verse 22, it says, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. Notice how Jesus responds at first. He did not answer her a word. He basically ignored her. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. You ignored her, Lord, and now she's shouting at us. But he answered and said, notice what he says next, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the household of Israel. He basically refuses her request. And then she came and at his refusal bowed down before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered and said, you'd think. He ignored her, then he refused her. Surely now that she bows down, he'll say, okay. He doesn't. He says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Seems like an insult. So he ignores her, he flat out refuses her, and then he insults her. How does she respond? But she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And Jesus said to her, O woman, your faith is great. Your crying out day and night caught my attention. Is what I see there. And she demonstrated the kind of faith that Jesus was mentioning. How did she demonstrate it? I see in verse 22, she came to him in her affliction. Have mercy on me, Lord. My daughter's cruelly demon-possessed. Even more than that, she came to him because of someone else's affliction. The first way that she demonstrated faith was she came to him in her affliction. The second way, if you look in the next verse, verse 23, she wasn't discouraged when he seemed to be ignoring her. She proved that in verse 24, it says verse 23, she kept shouting. Even when it seemed like he was ignoring her, she kept shouting. And then after Jesus declined her request, she bowed down to worship him. He declined her request and she bowed down, even when he refused her. And then, when Jesus seems to insult her, she readily admitted that she was nothing, and she accepted as her title whatever Jesus called her. She said, doesn't matter what I think I am. Whatever you say I am, that's who I am. She didn't try to defend herself, but she gladly admitted that his judgment must be correct. And then finally, by her persistence, she proved that she believed in his power and his goodness, despite all previous indications that she had had so far to the contrary. I just see here, it's amazing. In 6 verses, everything can change. From verse 22, she's afflicted. Verse 23, she's ignored. Verse 24, she's declined. Verse 26, she seems to be insulted. And yet, verse 27, in the face of all that, she refused to accept not receiving what she'd asked and persisted still. And then in verse 28, she had received what she had asked. And what spoke to me there is that it only takes a moment of persistence to break through if we have genuine, humble faith. And seeing this example really made me want to press through in the face of persistence, in the face of opposition. When it doesn't seem like I'm getting what I'm asking for, when what it seems like I'm asking for is a good thing, will I give up or will I continue to press on, believing in God's goodness? This is the kind of self-effacing, Christ-exalting, Christ-astonishing faith that he's looking for when he comes back to earth. There's a similar story in Mark, in chapter 10, if you want to turn there. It's much shorter. It's Mark chapter 10, in verse 47. It's the story of Bartimaeus. It says in verse 47 of Mark 10, it says, when Bartimaeus heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene who was coming down the road, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many were sternly telling him to be quiet. But listen to this. He kept crying out more. When people opposed him, when he was seeking the Lord, what did he do? He didn't say, oh, okay, never mind. Oh, it's probably inappropriate. He kept crying out more. This word of crying out, continually coming, crying out day and night. And Jesus, it says in verse 52, said to him, go, your faith has made you well. What kind of faith did Bartimaeus demonstrate? He kept crying out even in the face of opposition. And so I see that one way that I can demonstrate the kind of faith which Jesus is looking for when he returns is when I'm not getting what I want, in the face of opposition, I refuse to believe anything less than God's goodness, and I keep crying out. It doesn't matter what people think. It doesn't matter how ridiculous or foolish it looks. Think of how ridiculous the Syrophoenician woman must have looked. Jesus flat out refused her, and she bowed down and worshiped him. She was not at all interested in what anybody else thought. Bartimaeus, people are saying, dude, calm down. And it says he starts shouting louder. This is the kind of faith I see that Jesus is looking for when he returns. But it's not just in times of opposition. To me, that's a little bit more, I don't know if natural is the right word. It's not that crying out is natural, but I feel that it's, once we've come to the Lord, I think we're quicker to cry out in opposition. The other time that we need to cry out that I've seen is when we get what we want. And I've seen that there's a greater deception there because we can be lured into thinking that once we get what we want, we no longer need to cry. And I was really rewarded by looking at the story of Elisha in 2 Kings. If you want to turn there. 2 Kings in chapter 2. Elisha is a great picture of persistence, not in the face of opposition, but in the face of receiving what he'd asked for. He refused to settle for any experience short of all that God might want for him. We had seen if you look back, even turn a few pages to 1 Kings 19, in verse 19, it says, Elijah departed and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, while he was plowing, and Elijah passed over him and threw his mantle on him. So that's proof. It's kind of external proof that as God had already commanded Elijah, that the ministry of one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament was being passed down to this guy Elisha. And you'd think that I've got his mantle, which is kind of the outward symbol of the blessing and ministry and prophetic responsibility in the Old Testament. You would think that once Elisha got this go-ahead, he'd be good to embark upon his own, right? I got the mantle. God's already commanded Elijah to hand over his ministry in 1 Kings 19. And yet he doesn't do that. He followed faithful all the way into the second book of the Kings of Israel. And Elisha's persistence in following Elijah even after the blessing is a good picture for us, I think, in times of blessing. Because the question still comes to us, when we're blessed, when we get what we want, will we demonstrate the kind of faith that Jesus mentions in Luke 18? Will we still continually come when we got what we wanted? Will we still cry out day and night when we get what we want, when things are going well? What if the test, this brought the question to my mind, what if the test of our persistence is not what we do when we're ignored or declined or insulted, like the Syrophoenician woman? It might be the test for some, but for others, or if we're honest, I think all of us can say that sometime or another in our lives, we've been tested by receiving what we asked. We actually got the thing that we wanted, or even more than we could have ever asked for. It might be some meaningful experience with God. It might be some responsibility. It might be some word of encouragement. But the question is that enough? Am I satisfied when I get what I want? Do I stop persistently seeking? If so, I think I failed the test. If I stop persistently seeking when I get what I ask. God's blessings ought to produce in us a holy hunger for more rather than a satisfaction. We've seen, you think about the history of Israel, we've seen many times how the Old Testament recounts, once they had rest, they did evil again. Once they had exactly what God has promised, they turned to wickedness. And Israel's troubles began the moment that they had abundance, and that's a picture for us. It's a warning for us not to ease off when we've been abundantly supplied what we ask for. That in receiving, we have to continue seeking just as much as we continue seeking when we haven't gotten what we wanted. I think it's easier to think, I'll keep seeking if I haven't got what I wanted, but do I see the importance of seeking when I haven't? I fear that this may be actually where the devil can really deceive us. That in times of abundance, we don't continually cry out. We don't continually come. And Jesus didn't say, will the Son of Man find this kind of faith when he returns among those who still have needs? He said, this is what I'm looking for among all people. Not people who haven't gotten what they've received, but all people. Are they crying out day and night? And look at Elisha in 2 Kings, starting in verse 1. It says, it came about when the Lord was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. I've already got your mantle. I've already got the promise that I am going to receive your ministry, but I won't leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said, hey, do you know that the Lord's going to take away your master from over you today? What I hear them saying there is, do you know you're about to be your own prophet? You're about to get all that you ever wanted. Surely you can stop following Elijah now. You don't have to keep following him around. Stop this charade. And it happens twice more later in this passage that Elisha keeps following despite we can see every kind of stop on their journey is deeper and deeper experiences of fulfillment of God's word. But Elisha is not deterred by pursuing. And it made me wonder, will I be as undeterred from a greater pursuit by an experience with God as Elisha was by Elijah's insistence to remain at Gilgal or at Bethel, just as the Syrophoenician woman was at Jesus' resistance? I feel that I have reason to fear for us as a church, too, that because God speaks to us so faithfully, we can be, every week, right? We come here, every week we're richly fed by our younger brothers and sisters, as Arnaldo was saying. We're richly fed on Tuesdays and on Thursdays and on Sundays and on prayer meetings and on WhatsApp and on email, and we're nourished. We're amply supplied. And I feel I have a reason to fear that we may be easing up too in our own private lives, that there's a temptation because he's been so faithful to speak to us on Sunday mornings that we might be tempted to stop crying out desperately. And if that's the case, if we stop crying out, then what that says is that the blessing has not produced its desired effect. It made me think that I want us to be the rare church which, even though we're blessed on Sundays tremendously, as I said when I started, there's no place like home, so to speak. There's no place like NCCF. I know of no church that's so consistently a blessing, where I so consistently leave enriched and filled. And yet, can we also say that every other day is amazing too, because not because our meetings are dry, but because they produce in us each individually a hunger and a thirst, and because we've been filled, a greater crying out day and night, and a greater continuously coming to the Lord that's manifested in and fulfilled in our lives on Monday and on Tuesday. And on Wednesday we're crying out after the Tuesday meeting, brothers, and on Thursday and on Friday and Sunday afternoon, sisters, after the sisters meeting, you go home desperately crying out more and more. Many of us may be in jeopardy spiritually without ever knowing it because we're learning so much. Think of how much we learn here. Because we're so richly blessed by the fellowship. We have such rich fellowship. I hope that these joys culminate in a greater desperation and crying out in our private lives, because that's the kind of faith that Jesus is looking for when he returns. That's why I was thinking in John 7, it said Jesus stood up on the last day of the great fast, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, come to me." After all the rich meals, after all the fellowship, think about it, the fast lasted for many days. Jesus didn't stand up at the beginning saying, "If anybody's hungry," or "if anybody's thirsty." Everybody shows up because they're hungry. But the last day, after multiple days of feasting and drinking and having fellowship with God's people, then Jesus stands up, and it's like he's almost insane. It's almost crazy to stand up and say, "Is anybody still thirsty? If so, come to me." And I feel that that's a word of the Lord to us too. After this meeting, anybody still thirsty? We all leave full, but we're deceived if we leave full and it causes us to ease off in our pursuit. We should leave more desperate. We should leave crying out with more desperation than we came. It's it's a paradox of the faith in a way that we have to keep thirsting. And if this feast, if our meetings, if our gatherings, if our times of fellowship serve their true purpose, they stir up in us not only a satisfaction, but a ravenous hunger as well. If we find that hunger, we should come to Jesus. It's like the psalm that says, "What shall I offer the Lord for all of his benefits to me? I shall raise up the cup of salvation." It's like, more please. You've given me all this, more please. That should always be our attitude. And so it's not only in times of opposition that the Lord expects persistence, that he expects us crying out day and night. What I've seen, and I think the greater danger for me and for us, even as I face opposition, as we all do, we all face opposition. But the greater danger for us is when we don't face opposition, do we still cry out day and night? Will we still persistently, continuously come to the Lord to be filled more and more? May God help us.